The film opens up in the roads of London, where our fundamental person, a vagrant named James Bowen, is playing out certain tunes. He's giving everything he has, yet not a solitary passerby gives him consideration or cash. One of them just gives him an incomplete box of sandwiches. Around evening time, James gets hungry, so he hesitantly rummages the garbage bins and eats some extra food. Later, while he's searching for a spot to remain, he runs into his horrible companion Base, who asks about the closest opiate stealer. Anyway, James, who has recently stopped drugs, says that he doesn't have the foggiest idea about any vendors prior to leaving. Following this, James enters a cafe. Furthermore, orders a parcel of food. Unfortunately, when he includes the coins he has his pocket, it ends up being lacking for the feast. He tells the eatery proprietor that he will sing a melody for the clients in return for the excess measure of cash. Anyway, the impolite proprietor tosses the food into a sink and irately asks James to escape his eatery. Discouraged about what his life has become, James walks around the vacant roads, attempting to track down a protected spot to remain. Shockingly, he again meets Baz, who is sitting inside a vehicle. It's uncovered that the vehicle really has a place with a financial specialist who stopped, however, neglected to lock its entryways as it is coming down outside. James goes along with him without protesting. He likewise consumes a modest quantity of opiates to disregard his horrendous day. The next morning, when both James also Baz are still inside the vehicle, the proprietor shows up there and becomes maddened. Baz some way or another figures out how to escape the vehicle and escape. However, James has all the earmarks of being oblivious. Seeing this, the proprietor of the vehicle gets apprehensive and quickly calls an rescue vehicle to accompany James to the close-by medical clinic. Luckily, the matter isn't so serious, and he recovers cognizance. Following a couple of hours, while he's resting, Val has crisis. Social contact and restoration specialist approaches him. The fact that James has consumed a makes her enraged. Restricted drug, while likewise missing the prescriptions that were recommended to him. Accordingly, James earnestly apologizes to her, adage that it will at no point ever occur in the future. Next, subsequent to getting released from the emergency clinic, James meets Val at her office. The two examine his new treatment plan. What's more, Val endorses him another portion of methadone. She likewise stringently cautions him to visit her. Like clockwork, after James leaves, he goes directly to the roads and starts singing again. In the interim, Val converses with her senior about James. She needs to deal with a space for him so he can be off the roads and keep away from terrible individuals. To her enchant, the senior supports her thought. Later, Val imparts the uplifting news to James, and the last option is really glad that he can now live in a legitimate loft. Anyway, Val cautions him that he is still expected to follow the restoration plan stringently. Later at night, while James is scrubbing down, he hears a clamor coming from the kitchen. Apprehensive, he wraps a towel around his midsection and snatches a shoe. Prior to strolling into the kitchen to examine, incredibly, he views as a little earthy-colored feline close by his crate of cereal. Understanding that the feline is ravenous and searching for food, James quickly feels associated with the unfortunate creature and offers it some milk. He likewise allows it to spend the night in the house and even sings a exquisite melody for it the following morning. James conveys the feline and visits entryway in the area, attempting to find its actual owner. Anyway, none of the neighbors guarantee the feline, and James is driven away from it on the roads, trusting it will view as its home. All alone later, this James heads to the roads and begins singing tunes to the surprise of no one. Tragically, an elderly person tracks down irritating and arranges him to leave. While James is pressing his things. Unexpectedly he sees his dad Jack on the opposite side of the road and surges to meet him. Here we get to know that James has been deserted by his loved ones after his dad wedded another lady named Hillary who can't stand James' presence. As the dad-child pair is speaking, Hillary shows up there and pulls Jack away, saying that she won't ever welcome James to the Christmas festivity. Anyway, prior to leaving, Jack gives up a cash to James and lets him know that he could ponder welcoming him for supper some other time. When James gets back, he finds a similar feline holding up outside. He delicately gets it a notification that it has wounds all around its body. Stressed, James contacts his creature-cherishing neighbor Betty, who recommends he quickly take the feline to a close-by vet facility. She likewise gives the feline a name, Bounce. Following this, James quickly visits the facility and burns through the entirety of his cash to purchase prescriptions for Bounce. He additionally misses his booked gathering with Val later. Getting back, James attempts to take care of the meds to sway, yet flops wretchedly. Crushed, he takes him to Betty and inquires for her assistance. The last option has chipped in the vet center a few times, so she easily takes care of business. She then, at that point, begins opening up to James and makes it clear that she despises drugs and the individual utilizing them. Hearing this, he lies to Betty about his calling and tells her that he's really a performer. The following day, James visits Val at her office. What's more, apologizes for missing his planned meeting. Then, at that point, starts enlightening her regarding his feline. What's more, his developing closeness with Betty. Anyway, Val isn't persuaded that James has adequately recuperated to begin taking on the obligation of the feline and a sweetheart. She recommends James deal with himself. Also, try not to get into connections. Later, James accepts Val's recommendation and drops the feline in the city. Anyway, when he sheets a transport, we follows him there and sits on his lap. Everybody inside the transport begins commending the lovable feline and the ticket gatherer. Indeed, even gives James shoestrings to use as a chain. In the wake of getting off the transport, James conveys weave on his shoulders and strolls towards his typical spot. Shockingly, this time a tremendous group assembles to watch him perform. They likewise give him liberal tips, making it his most noteworthy assortment. James is overjoyed that he's at last getting acknowledgement and love in light of the feline. So he chooses to keep it. Previously, getting back, he likewise purchases legitimate food for Weave in the accompanying scene. While James is searching for an area to perform, Baz shows up and demands some money to purchase food. James feels miserable to see his companion in such a condition and promptly offers him some cash out of compassion prior to leaving. He then, at that point, performs and draws a bigger crowd than the past case in expansion to some feline food. An old lady likewise gives Sway a scarf she as of late weaved in recognition of her late feline. Soon thereafter, James startlingly catches Betty and welcomes her out for supper. Regrettably, Betty specifies that she's a vegetarian. However, regardless, she welcomes James for a feast to her loft. James obliges, and that night the two have loads of fun. On his way back home, he sees Baz lying on the walkway oblivious. He approaches him immediately and asks the close-by individuals to call an emergency vehicle. Unfortunately, Baz has as of now passed on in light of an excess, and when James at long last understands this, he is crushed. Following this, James once more visits Betty at her home, where she admits that her sibling was additionally an junkie who went too far to death. Therefore, she abhors each and every individual who consumes drugs. Betty filling James in about Her siblings' experience and Baz's unexpected death make James considerably more still up in the air to go without opiates. During his resulting meeting with Val, James specifies that he's frantic to quit utilizing opiates and asks her to diminish his methadone measurements anyway. Betty encourages him to go cautiously and not hustle into stopping opiates, since doing so would be awful for his mental and actual well-being. Val tells him, however, that assuming he keeps swearing off opiates and taking the suggested measure of methadone, she would before long ponder diminishing his methadone dose. The scene then moves to James and Betty having an extraordinary Christmas together. James even takes Betty out on the town, while making a lifetime obligation to her. Sometime thereafter he makes the choice to go observe Christmas at his dad's place, and he likewise conveys a jug of wine as a gift. Tragically, notwithstanding the way that he's been drug-free for an extremely extensive stretch, the family deals with him like a junkie, and, surprisingly, his little stepsisters are rude to him. While James is bantering with his father, Weave unexpectedly jumps out of his lap and begins to go around breaking an expensive blossom container and different things in the process. In light of this, Hillary hollers at him and his dad, and in the long run James gets ousted from the house. The following day, when James is busking in front of a huge crowd, a canine suddenly pees on his guitar sack. This infuriates James, and he begins tussling with the canine proprietor after while the specialists show up and keep him for making confusion openly. Luckily, the CCTV tape demonstrates that James is honest, and Val additionally appears at the police headquarters to save him. James, anyway, is denied from acting in public for a time of a half-year. Val likewise sees that he hasn't taken his endorsed everyday portion of methadone, so she cautions him to begin taking them on the off chance that he needs to keep sway with him. Reluctant to lose his main organization, James races to the close-by center and takes the measurement of methadone. Unbeknownst to him, Betty is additionally in a similar center, and she learns that James is really a heroin fiend. Irritated, Betty hollers at him and goes up against him for deceiving her and breaking her trust, having lost his main kind of revenue. Also, sweetheart James gets back and later visits a news organization to go after a paper dealer position. He is employed by the supervisor, who likewise reminds him to limit his paper deals inside the limits of his doled-out area. James then, at that point, begins selling papers immediately. Also, attracts outsiders who need to take pictures with Weave later as he walks through the region of another paper. 2 or 3 methodologies. Him purchases a paper and requests to snap a picture with Weave. Anyway, his rival seller sees him selling the paper in his district and grumbles to the paper office about it. Therefore, James is disallowed from selling papers for a month. After that, James runs into Betty and really tries to set things straight anyway. She is as yet incensed and will not address him. James at long last winds up between a rock and a hard place financially. Following a couple of days, yet in spite of his poor condition, he chooses to buy food for Weave as opposed to himself, then in different places where the police will not promptly find him. He begins performing tunes by the roadside to his awful karma. Betty sees him making it happen, and since he's still waiting on the post-trial process, she yells at his ineptitude and finishes their relationship. Following a month, James gets back to selling papers. One day, while working, a brutal lady endeavors to buy sway from him. At the point when James courteously dismisses 2 canines close by begin yelping at Bounce, terrifying him and provoking him to escape. James attempts to find the unfortunate creature In any case, without much of any result for the following couple of days, he is let be disturbed as Bounce still doesn't get back home. At one point he nearly returns to opiates, yet he stops himself without a moment to spare. Fortunately, Bounce returns home, and when they rejoin, James understands that he's currently ready to quit utilizing methadone. The following day, James visits Val and asks her to release his methadone measurements. She consents to his solicitation and encourages him to get ready for the withdrawal side effects. James then meets Betty and illuminates her about his arrangements for a medication detox plan. Hearing this, she becomes cheerful, and the two at long last offer to set things straight. Betty, moreover, chooses to help James by conveying feasts to his room in the wake of misery. During a time of horrendous withdrawal side effects, James is at long last ready to quit utilizing drugs. He then, at that point, visits Betty just to find that she's about to move out of the city. Before long, she leaves in the wake of giving James her new location in the expectations that he will visit her not long after. Observing film of James and Sway performing together a book composing business, contacts James and requests that he compose a book on their kinship. Following this, James is acquainted with the composition division's main, who offers him a shiny new PC to begin his work later. James goes to his dad's home to let him realize he is without drug. This makes Jack cheerful, and he at last recognizes his shortcoming and apologizes for leaving James behind. In the last scene, James is welcomed by a sizable crowd at the book send-off occasion, and Val, Jack and Betty compliment him on his accomplishment. James likewise says something in which he offers thanks to each and every individual who upheld him during his difficult life's excursion. The film closes with James and Sway doing what they love most, performing on the roads.